Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. Before we jump into topics, I just want to mention that we will be going on our winter break after our Bounty and Binary episodes on the 13th and 14th of December, and we'll be returning on January 10th and 11th. So that will be a 3-week break. So, yeah, I just wanted to give you guys some advance notice because that is, 2 weeks out, I believe. After the 13th and 14th, we'll be on a break for a few weeks. But yeah, with that out of the way, we'll jump into our topics for this week. So up first, we have an advisory from GitHub Security Lab on a set of issues in Gerapy, which is a Python-based crawler management service. Um, both issues here are fairly straightforward. They were both command injections. The first one being a command injection in the project clone endpoint. Here it would take a user-controlled address and use it to craft a git clone command that was passed into the shell. And yeah, it just passes like user-controlled input directly into that command. It doesn't do any sanitization or anything. So
Yeah, and I
pretty
mean,
straightforward command injection.
really, just avoid this already. When it comes to opening things, like unless you need it, because a big part of the issue here, the big thing you can kind of look for if you're doing that source review is this shell equals true is kind of a big giveaway that somebody's doing something wrong. It's it's not super common that you actually need to execute a command in a shell like this. Um, just dropping in, like, basically they're crafting the string, so you can almost look for this in the same way that you might SQL injection when you look for them to be crafting the SQL string rather than using prepared statements. Similarly, you can there are ways to open a new process and just say, like, you're opening this process, you're opening it, and giving it each argument independently. Oh, that's kind of how you should go about it.
Yeah, I
I
mean
mean,
that's mainly
it's
what the sub process module is for, right?
ideally, yeah. Um, so I mean, it's one of those things I hate every time we see it because it's such an easy thing to avoid. Of course, I mean, languages also make it pretty easy to do this the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. It's laziness, right? It's just so much easier to just pass a command into the shell and like let that do all the work instead of doing the setting up the correct sub process call. So
Yeah, and actually, root mentions I think PHP almost always spawns command on Windows for some reason. Yeah, I PHP, like, one of the easiest ways of making that call is, like, shell exec, all of those I believe will by default do that. That probably goes back to its Perl history. Um yeah, PHP has had kind of a big issue with that, and actually I couldn't tell you how to do it securely in PHP. There probably is a function call, I just don't know it offhand. Spartan uh GTR asked, wait, what's the issue with shell equals true? Shell equals true isn't an issue itself. It just hints that there's an issue because shell equals true is effectively stating here that with open, sh and then pass whatever my command is in there. Like, it's basically indicating that you're going to pass whatever command's being provided. Don't execute that on its own, like as a single program. Treat it as a shell command, which then means you can do things like break out and start using other commands and everything else. So that's where shell equals true is just a hint or an indicator that you can look for that there's a probable issue here, or at least they're not doing things in the way I would consider a secure or proper way. Obviously, you can use this without issue, like a static command isn't going to be much of an issue. But seeing user input making its way to that is usually going to be, it's one of those warning flags.
yeah, it's a code smell basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, this issue existed again in another place. This time in the project parse endpoint. And this took parts of the user provided data in the post request to construct a call to Gerapy parse. And same thing, just passing user input to a shell with no sanitization or anything.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, they added a little bit around it this time. It is an argument, but because there's no sanitization, doesn't really matter.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that as of yet, it doesn't seem like these vulnerabilities are fixed. If you go to the GitHub issues that they link to, it basically says it's been 90 days and we're disclosing it publicly. They gave them an additional week before actually doing so, and there was no response to the issue or anything. So, uh, yeah, it just seems like these could be 0 days. So,
There
these
you
really
go.
trivial issues that can be taken advantage of seems like they don't want to fix them. So,
And speaking of 0 days, I want to jump back and also thank Mojo Dojo for the Prime sub at the start of the stream.
oh
I
yeah, good
think we
remember.
forgot to call that out.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I meant to do that at the beginning of the stream. All right, so getting into some HackerOne reports, we have a jitsi-meet authentication bypass through JWT forgery. Z, I know you like some of the JWT stuff and like to talk about it, so I'll let you take this one. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and this one's just kind of a fun issue. It has to do with having a little bit of a disconnect between when they're processing the input versus actually validating the JWT. The JWT validation kind of works as you'd expect, reads the JWT, reads the values out of it, processes it, sees what algorithm, and just figures out if it's valid. The thing is, when it's processing and pulling out the data, and I'm going to pull up the patch here, when it's going through that, let's see if I can find the code I'm thinking of. It'll pull out the public key as just like, here's the key that you should be using to validate this token. And then, assuming it goes through, it finds it properly, um, it'll just end up calling the verify token. It'll pass in that public key as it's coming through, expecting it to be expecting the JWT's algorithm to be using the public key. So the problem in this case is if you set that algorithm to something that isn't asymmetric, so it's not using like the RS or yeah, I believe it's RSA that it would be at least based around. If you set to something, they use the example of HS 256. If you set it to that, it'll be using that public key, which it pulled, as the private key, because verify token just knows that's the secret. It will treat that as the secret because it sees the algorithm as being symmetric. It doesn't know that it's supposed to be a public key in that case, just given how they wrote the code, that little bit of a disconnect. So I think it's a really fun issue in that sense. Not something I've seen before, where you've got the public key being used as the shared secret instead. It basically with that, because obviously public key is meant to be public, you can forge the token. You can create hero because you can also access that public key. So great little issue there. They did get a bounty out of this, I think, or maybe not. Sorry, I'm
I
thinking
don't
of a
think that was
different.
disclosed. In this case, like it was very like limited disclosure. They didn't have any of the comments or anything. And yeah, I didn't see anything that indicated like a payout, but
Yeah, no,
at the
I'm
same
looking
time, I'm
here.
not sure if that
It's
would be hidden in this case either.
Yeah, it's not on the side where it usually would be, so I'll assume I was just mistaken about that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean the main issue there is just not checking that algorithm field from the header to make sure that it's a value that they expect, right? So yeah, if you can just pass like HMAC SHA-256 in there or something like that, then yeah, you can exploit it like you were saying. Um, yeah, like I said, unfortunately, not too much detail there. An interesting issue. We do try to look at the back and forth sometimes, as usually there's some interesting information in there, but here that's not available. Though you can dig into the fix because they do link to that, and their fix is as you'd expect. It just does some checks on that ALG field and make sure that it's set to the algorithm that is actually asymmetric.
Yeah,
um,
at least for that case, yeah, they just check, make sure it starts with RS, and well, I mean they also do a nil check, but that's a bit different. Yeah, they add that in there. Really simple fix. So you kind of get an idea of what's going on here. But the main issue requires you go a little bit further out and kind of see how they've architected that verify token. Because verify token technically isn't wrong here. It's just the fact that it doesn't know it's expecting a public key in this case.
Yeah.
Definitely a
All
great
right.
issue, though.
Oh yeah, for sure. It was a cool issue. So up next, we have a Shopify auth bypass and Stocky, which is their inventory management solution, where a non-privileged user in Stocky can create a new admin user. Actually, I'll rephrase that. Anybody can create a new admin user, even somebody that's not logged in, which makes this even funnier. And this is due to the fact that the users slash create admin endpoint simply either doesn't have an auth check or has insufficient auth checking. The report doesn't really delve into which is the case here. So yeah, all you have to do is get a cookie and an authentication token, which, as I hinted at earlier, you don't even have to be logged in to get that, by the way. All you have to do is go to the Stocky login page, try any login, and you'll get a token and cookie back in the response. So if you just sub that cookie and token in to a request to the create admin endpoint, it goes through and you can create a new admin user and then you can just log in as that admin user. It just seems like there's really weak authentication going on here. This one's a little bit tough to explain without knowing some of the intricate details because this is a weird flow to allow, especially something as powerful as create admin.
I mean,
And that's
it's.
pretty wild that you can get a token that like has the ability to create admin users without even needing to log in as an unprivileged user.
I mean, the token very well might just be something that reflects just the fact that you have like a session, more like a session token than anything else. But I mean, whoever was writing this code, what was going through their mind? Like, I am genuinely curious if there is like, if there was some check here, but it just, a typo, like, instead of checking if it's equal to true, doing like an assignment to true or something, like that sort of issue that can just kind of escape the human eye a bit.
Kind of
Um,
excuse it a little bit.
yeah, because otherwise it's like, who creates a, create admin endpoint and doesn't think about security? Like,
Yeah,
it's
if there
one
was
of
one
those
area you
places.
want to create with security in mind, it would probably be something like that.
Yeah, so I'm kind of hopeful that there's a little more to that story that we don't know. And out of chat, Bleak asked, "Did you collect some really dumb issues this week?" Unfortunately, yes. There are a number of dumb issues this week.
This is the week for dumb issues. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we should title the episode, just the dumb issues special or something. Maybe we'll retitle the VOD or something. But yeah, as we've said already, stupid issue. But it did yield a $1,600 bounty, so that's good for the researcher there. Next, we have an access token leak in the CXL services internal GCP project through a whitelist bypass on the proxy endpoint. The bypass is based on a somewhat known trick that I think we might have covered before, but I'm not 100% sure. But the trick here is basically to use the backslash and then the at symbol trick to trick the validation into parsing the left side of the at as the authority, and then the second part is the path. And by doing that, you can get proxied to your own domain, and it'll send the access token with it since it thinks it's going to a Google domain, but actually it's going to your own. Um,
Yeah, and
to
this
and
one was a little bit interesting because they do obviously validate it a bit.
Yeah,
And it had to do with a disconnect between the regex that does that validation, thinking the domain is the jobs Google API, but the request library, um, treating it as just the your domain and the rest as the path. Just having that disconnect there between them. They actually call out a. It's probably using the vulnerable regex from the RFC, which isn't loading here, but yeah. Such a lovely regex. And for those of you who can't see, you're welcome.
yeah, one of those fun desyncs. Um, The that gets leaked here can be used to hit other scopes like the auth dispatcher, jobs, and cloud platform. They state it can be used for full access to other GCP projects as well, such as Stocky demo and CXL services itself, as well as limited access to garage staging and P jobs. They don't really go into detail on like what those do or what they're for, just stating that it can hit those. So that yielded a $4,133 bounty. Google then tried to fix this issue by disallowing the \@ but that was bypassable because if you just put something in between the backslash and the @ then it would pass that check, but the issue still remained. So that yielded another $3,000 bounty. And then that's not it. There's also more. Even after they fixed that route, it was still possible to exploit this issue by calling into old versions of the default service, which then yielded another $3,000. So it took a few attempts to fully fix
Yeah,
the issue, but
a few attempts. I appreciate the fact that Google pays out on that though, rather than just on the single. Just like on the core issue, he got an extra $6,000 or a little bit more because it's Google, so they always do the leaked values. But yeah, I mean, definitely appreciate the fact they paid him out on all of those bypasses, because I know some other companies definitely would not.
I know we
Um,
say this a lot with like Google and whatnot, but again, I was kind of like a little bit surprised that it took them like that they had some of these faulty fixes in place that just weren't very thorough. It's not something you really expect out of Google. Usually, when they like get bug reports, they're pretty thorough in testing them and making sure they're fixed. But this could have been just one of those areas where the security just wasn't in mind as much or whatever. So I don't know. I do like to
yeah,
call that
I
out
don't.
because it's easy to think Google is like infallible, and you look at them and they're like, "Oh, I'm never going to research a Google target." They've got engineers and teams of engineers that are way smarter than me, and it's always nice to look at and see like, yeah, they can make mistakes too, right? Like, and this is why it's worth it to look at some of these targets that even though you think they would be infallible because it's Google, you know, obviously that's not the case, as you can see with reports like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair point on the fact they do make mistakes. I think sometimes also just on the researcher side, thinks, well, they know the issue, therefore they probably fixed it all right, and only really going for the like, does it reproduce rather than trying to break it other ways. I mean, fixing issues like it's always with the attacker kind of has the advantage where they just need to find one way around however it was fixed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it is just the researcher doesn't always do a good job of testing their or testing the fixes also, rather than it always being that Google just always fixes it first time. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure they do fix plenty first time, but we don't really have the metrics on that either, I suppose. Yeah, ultimately, I mean, they got like 10 grand out of this and a bit of change.
Yeah. Sorry for those in chat who are talking about like the stream dying and stuff like that. Yeah, it seems like Twitch is having some problems right now. I think my stream had some weird issues earlier too, like the chat wouldn't load, and I had to refresh the page. I don't know what's going on there. Twitch is just having a day again. Like every like 2 days, Twitch has weird problems like this. Um, but yeah, we can't repeat everything we said over the last couple minutes. You'll just have to go back to the VOD for that. All right, but yeah, we will move into our last topic of the episode here, which is a report to GitLab, which details a prototype pollution bug in Mermaid, which leads to stored XSS. If Mermaid sounds familiar to you, it's because we talked about it somewhat recently. I don't remember if it was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. I think that sounds about right, but I don't remember exactly when we talked about it last. But yeah, Mermaid is GitLab's flavored markdown that supports diagrams and whatnot. The last time we talked about it, it was an XSS through diagram labels. This one is prototype pollution due to the ability to set the proto attribute in the directives. So you can get prototype pollution on something like template attributes, which will then cause things like clicking on the search bar to execute an XSS payload. Um, I think the impact on this one is a little bit less than the last one that we covered because it does require some user interaction. Though realistically, it's probably about the same impact because expecting a target to click on something like a search bar on GitLab is not an unreasonable ask. Um, it's
It's
also worth noting, though, that the victim does have to be logged in for this to work as well. Um, but
it's
the
not
stipulations there aren't
unreasonable,
huge.
but at the same time, how often do you go to the search bar just on a random repository? At least for myself, like my usual usage would be I'm looking at a specific repository and then want to search within it. So unless I had a reason to search inside of one with the XSS, like it does feel like a little bit of a stretch for most people. So that is kind of a limitation on it.
Yeah. I would say it's a little bit less impactful than the last one we covered, but it's not
It's still
being
possible.
tossed into the unreasonable category. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's so yeah, I mean victim has to be logged in, but again, that's not a big ask. Um this ended up giving a $3,000 bounty though. So yeah,
Yeah.
another good payoff for the researcher.
Yeah, and there was also a patch that was bypassed. Basically bypass they had just prevented using proto, so use prototype. Um Basically just incomplete fix.
I swear to God, we see that bypass with like every prototype pollution we cover. There's always a bypass around it, just because of how many different ways you can access the prototype in JavaScript.
It almost feels, like maybe, some researchers might be aware of the fact that it won't get fully patched and use that hopefully for their own advantage to get a second payout. I don't know if they got one in this case. Uh, I mean, they do have a $2,000 bounty later, so perhaps that was related, but I mean, you could do that if you wanted to rather than reporting it because usually you don't necessarily see that mentioned at the outset as like, yeah, you can also call it these other ways. It's just you can call it with proto and not giving enough information for them to fully fix it.
Yeah, that is a bit of a cynical take, but at the same time, I can definitely see it. Oh,
Yeah, I could see it. I'm not saying that's what happened here. I that is a cynical take. I mean, I would hope people aren't doing that, but it is one of those things where you could make the report a bit more clear that like other attributes can also be set
for sure.
to do this.
Yeah, it does also make me wonder, like, why does JavaScript provide so many like keywords that do the same thing? Like, why do we need three different keywords to access the prototypes? Um, it
Well,
almost
it's
seems
underscore
intentionally
underscore
designed to.
proto prototype, and then I think it's more you can get access to it also through the constructor rather than like it's technically I think it's different though because constructor is just like going to give you new function, new object back. I don't know JavaScript well enough to reason on how that one works, but I think the other route you still need to go constructor proto or constructor prototype, so you're technically only accessing it through those two options.
Yeah,
Um
I don't know. When I think about it, though, it just seems like one of those things where it almost seems like it's designed to be hard to prevent, like being able to access it.
I,
Um,
I
but
I mean I doubt early on there was even much thought into the security implications of that.
probably not.
It's one of those things like JavaScript is a very dynamic language and that dynamic aspect of it just creates a lot of unintended routes. It's kind of like a Python sandbox escapes. For a while, those were common in CTFs. It's just like because it's such dynamic language, there's so many ways to get access to the same piece of data, even if you say remove all the imported modules or something. It's you can still find ways to access like generic objects and make your way around. So it kind of just goes with the territory too.
Yeah. All right, but yeah, that pretty much sums up all the topics that we have for this episode. Unless you have any final words you wanted to get in, Z, we'll move into wrapping it up.
Nope. That's all for this week.
All right, yeah. So sorry, it was a bit of a short episode for this week. We were kind of limited on topics, as you saw. We had we had some of the really quick and trivial issues. So yeah, we haven't gone on as in depth as we have in some other episodes, but um, you know, that's just how the week went. So yeah,
Yeah, I
thank you
mean,
to everyone. Oh, go
there
ahead.
were still a couple interesting issues there. I love that JWT one. Just it was a unique scenario. So it was a good week anyhow. But uh, I don't mind the shorter episodes either.
Yeah. So yeah, with that said, thanks to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the bot on Twitch immediately or on other platforms like YouTube tomorrow. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more links on Anchor. If you want to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter, links for those are down below or in the chat. Um, we'll be back tomorrow for the binary episode at 10 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, which is also where we'll cover the Spot the Vuln solution that was shown in the pre-stream. We have that in the Discord as well, for those of you who might have missed it. Also, just want to quickly mention again that we will be going on our winter break after our bounty and binary episodes on the 13th and 14th of December, and we'll be returning January 10th and 11th. So, yeah, we'll be gone for those 3 weeks. And yeah, with all that said, we'll see you tomorrow when we return for our binary podcast. Take care.